Good morning from a sunny Dublin. I'm only sorry I can't be with you in Berlin. It would be good to actually be able to engage, but I guess we're all getting used to these Zoom meetings these days. First of all, just say thank you very much to COFACE and AGF for the invitation to this event. I think it is a really important and timely event, so I would congratulate you on organizing it. The Child Guarantee is, I believe, a very exciting and important initiative. It's still, of course, work in progress. So there is a real opportunity, I think, to still influence the design of how the guarantee will emerge and how it will be operated. I think it's become even more important, and we heard this from Annemie and Daniela in the context of COVID. And I know that myself, I happen to chair a network of community organizations in some of the most deprived communities in inner city Dublin. And we have become very concerned about the impact on children as a result of COVID and how this is deepening some of the inequalities and social exclusion experienced by those children and the potential long-term effects. So I think this makes the guarantee even more important. I suppose just the other thing to say is, and it's said very clearly, I think, in the opening remarks by Annemie, that the issue of child poverty is also an issue of family poverty. And if we're going to tackle child poverty, we have to also look at the situation of their families. And that, of course, is why the voice of COFACE in this debate is really so important. I mean, your track record on this is extraordinary over a long period, and I think it is great that you're spending a day discussing this, and I'm sure that your conclusions at the end will be incredibly useful to the Commission and to everybody involved in designing the Child Guarantee. In my input, I've been asked to do just a few sort of scene-setting things. First of all, to explain a bit about the origins and context of the Child Guarantee. Secondly, to outline just some of the key findings from the feasibility study that I was involved with many others in, including Reka, who's on the panel happily. And then to outline some of the issues we're looking at in the phase 2 of the feasibility study. And I'll just make a mention, I was asked to make a mention about the Commission roadmap, but I'm sure Katerina will do that far better and in more detail than I will in due course. So just to start with the ambition that was set by the European Parliament, that every child at risk of poverty, including refugee children, has access to free healthcare, free education, free childcare, decent housing, and adequate nutrition. This ambition, this call by the European Parliament back in November 2015, which led to their call for the establishment of a child guarantee, I think was a very exciting and ambitious moment. And I think it's worth just asking ourselves, why did they call for a child guarantee to guarantee these things for children in poverty? I think the first reason was that they were looking at the implementation of the Commission's 2013 recommendation on investing in children, breaking the cycle of poverty and disadvantage, which was a really useful recommendation. It creates, I think we all think, a very strong framework for tackling issues around child poverty. But there was a feeling, I think, that the implementation of it on the ground had been disappointing. It hadn't had the scale of impact that many of us had hoped at the time. And I think the Parliament were concerned by this. And then, of course, the second thing they looked at was the high levels of child poverty and social exclusion that persisted still across the European Union. And obviously there were variations, but there was child poverty and social exclusion in all countries, but in some it was much deeper and more serious. And this was prompting them to take a new look at the issue. That led to an engagement between the Commission and the Parliament. And out of that came the idea of a preparatory action, which is a way of investigating a new way forward for the Commission in certain policy areas. So they agreed to have a preparatory action with 3 phases: an initial feasibility study, then a second study on an economic implementing framework, and a third phase would be pilot projects. So there's quite a sort of complex process put into train. I think it's also just, if you're looking at the context, worth thinking that the context shifted after 2015. And I think what was really important here was the European Pillar of Social Rights in November 2017, when it was proclaimed by the Parliament, the Council and the Commission. I think this was a shift in European social policy, or perhaps a return to a greater emphasis on a stronger social Europe. And within that, Principle 11 is really important because it talks about children having the right to protection from poverty, and children from disadvantaged backgrounds having the right to specific measures to enhance equal opportunities. So the idea of a child guarantee was now in a much sort of stronger environment. I think another bit of the framework that's worth reflecting on is that negotiations were starting about the new round of EU funds from 2021 to 2027. And strikingly, in December 2018, the Parliament proposed allocating 5.9 billion euro to support the child guarantee. So they were making a very strong link between the idea of a child guarantee and putting in some support, increased financial support to children in poverty through EU funds. Then the final bit I just want to highlight in terms of the context was the new European Commission. And I think this was very striking. I'd have to say, I think the view of the Commission, if we went back to 2015, 2017, was somewhat skeptical, in my experience, about the need for a child guarantee, given that there was already a Commission recommendation, and also some hesitancy, I think, about how much the Commission could actually do in this area, which they felt was primarily the responsibility of member states. That perhaps skepticism disappeared, I think, in 2019 with the new Commission, when the incoming president, setting out what she was going to do to the Parliament, said, to support every child in need, I will create the European Child Guarantee, picking up on the idea proposed by the European Parliament. That undoubtedly had a big impact on the approach within the Commission. I mean, my experience was a lot more people suddenly within the Commission got interested in the child guarantee. Now it had become a political priority. And when she was confirmed as president, she followed through on this by appointing responsibility to the Commissioner for Jobs and Social Rights. And I would encourage people to listen to his little video, because it's a very positive statement about the importance of the child guarantee, Nicholas Smith. But also, interestingly, she gave a coordinating role to the Vice President for Democracy and Demography, so that this would cut across different parts of the Commission's work. And I think that's really important recognition. If you're going to deal with issues in relation to children, they need to be cross-cutting across different areas. There's no one area that's going to solve the problem. Let me now say a bit about what we found from the feasibility study. And there were a lot of us involved in this process, and it involved an awful lot of different reports. And it would take me probably 2 or 3 days to tell you everything that's in it. But the final report summarizes a lot of it. So there's 286 pages in that I would commend to you. But we had country reports from every country. We had policy papers looking at the 5 areas highlighted by the Parliament. The Commission asked us specifically to look at 4 target groups: children residing in institutions, children with disabilities, children with a migrant background, and children living in precarious family situations. So we had reports on each of those groups. We had 8 case studies looking at different international funding programs. We had online consultation with key stakeholders. I'm sure many of you were involved in that. We had 4 consultations or focus groups with children. We then had, this time last year, in fact, 4 fact-finding workshops where we discussed the issues in relation to each of that, and a lot of practitioners took part. That all led to a big intermediate report, which was then provided a basis for a discussion at a large final conference in February this year in Brussels. I think it was the last time I was in Brussels before the world shut down. And then that led to the final report in June, and I give a link there. You can find it online, and indeed some of the other reports are available online as well on the Commission website. Just in terms of the report, I mean, as I said, there's a lot in it, and I and I think it's a sort of useful resource document for people, depending on what you want. If you want to look at the legal basis of the chapter on that, you want to look at people's ideas about EU funding programs, there's sections on that. And there's an awful lot of information about what is going on the ground on the different issues and practical policy approaches. But I'm just going to try and give you a very quick summary of the main findings that we had. I think the first thing was just a clear finding from looking at the scale of the issues facing the 4 groups of children we looked at and the access to the 5 policy areas, that there is a real problem in many countries. Indeed, in all countries, there is a problem for some children, but in some countries it's more extensive than in others. So action is needed to address this lack of access of children to services in many countries. So there is a need for more action. Second thing, we just reinforced, I think there's a very clear message coming from the ground, that the lack of access has short and long-term negative consequences for children and for the broader society. So this is a societal problem that needs to be addressed. We also clearly documented, by looking at a lot of the international things on children's rights and EU on children's rights, that the lack of access to the 5 policy areas represents a failure to uphold children's rights. And of course the question was, okay, children have rights to these things, but is it feasible to guarantee that children should have rights? Well, we examined policies across a whole range of countries, and there's clear evidence of many good policies in many countries that successfully ensure that children in poor situations do have access to the rights set out by the Parliament. And that proves that it is feasible to do it, but often there are gaps in the way that those rights are met and need to be filled, but it is possible to do it. The question then was looking at, we're asked to focus at 4 particular groups, but the more we looked and the more at the issue and the more we listened to people, was a stressing that the 5 policy areas, there was a need to focus on all children in vulnerable situations, indeed on all children having access to those key areas of services. The next finding was the need for a twin-track approach. There was a strong emphasis on the value of having good universal services for all children, but for children in disadvantaged situations, they often need more support to access. So effective approaches combine universal services with additional supports targeted at children in more vulnerable situations and indeed their families. There was also a lot of evidence that it's not just enough to have official access for children, but it's the quality of mainstream services, that they're inclusive and that they avoid stigma and segregation. So the quality and the way they ensure that vulnerable children are included in them is very important to look at, not just to technically have access. Then there was a lot of people telling us that access to the 5 policy areas is certainly necessary to tackle poverty, but it's not sufficient to tackle poverty and social exclusion. We had a lot of emphasis from people on the importance of income support, on the importance of supporting parents into work, and then there was quite a lot of emphasis on the importance of participation of children in leisure and sport activities, but also in decisions that affect them. So there were other things that need to happen as well as these areas if you're going to tackle poverty. We also reached a clear view, it's not enough to address one area on its own, but you need to have a comprehensive approach to meeting the needs of children, that different policy areas interact. If you want children to do well in education, it's important that their health is good, it's important that they have adequate nutrition, it's important that they have decent housing. You won't solve the problem by just looking at one policy in isolation. So it's very important, and the countries that seem to do best tend to have a comprehensive approach to the inclusion of children. The Commission then asked us to look very much at what was the legal basis for doing work in this area, and where did the responsibility lie between member states and between what might be done at European level. And it's quite clear that the primary responsibility for ensuring access to 5 policy areas rests with member states. But equally, it is clear that EU action is feasible in this area, that there is a clear legal basis for the Commission to act in terms of policy coordination and guidance and providing financial support between EU funds. So there is additional support and help that can be given at European level to support and encourage efforts at national level or subnational level. And indeed, that was a very important issue for whether there is a legal basis for a child guarantee. And there's a very complicated and technical chapter on all of this area in the report that if you're interested in, I would recommend it to you. The feeling was we looked at what the Commission already does and the EU already does, and certainly there have been a lot of useful things done, particularly going back to the original Commission recommendation, and there's been a lot of good exchange and learning. There's been some financial support given to initiatives in this area, but there was a feeling that a new initiative could bring real added value and more momentum to many of the things and make more effective use of EU instruments, and perhaps give it a higher political priority within what the EU is doing. And again, there's a lot in the report and suggestions about the way this might happen. Very particularly, we did look at the EU funds, and we concluded that there is considerable potential to play a more effective and strategic role. Now, part of that comes from looking where there are good examples from the way funds have been used already, but also by saying very often they've been used in a rather piecemeal manner and not very strategically. And actually, I think we found it very difficult to find hard facts and figures about the amount of EU funds that actually benefit children. This hadn't been something that had been documented particularly rigorously, and should be a much clearer priority in future if one is to get the maximum effect. And that's not to say that we think the solution is EU money is going to solve the problem. It is a catalyst that will get member states perhaps to do more and more strategically, and also generate more national and subnational funding. In terms of political leadership, I mean, looking at experience in other areas, clear, strong political leadership at the EU level undoubtedly can reinforce what member states will do and the priority that is given to this. And that would be the big advantage about having this as a clear priority at the European Council. Also, I mean, the evidence again was that mainstreaming support for the implementation of a new initiative across the Commission would help in ensuring that all its instruments are used. And that was why we were so encouraged by the emphasis that the President was giving to this being something operating across the Commission. And then I guess the final finding that I should highlight is that there was considerable popular and political demand for a child guarantee, and that came out clearly from the Parliament. It came out from the online consultation. It was very evident at the various workshops we ran and at the final conference. And there is a lot of support and interest in a child guarantee. We identified in the final report, and they were part of the discussion at the final conference, some issues that really need to be teased out more or resolved more in designing a child guarantee. And I think there were about 9 issues in the final report. I just wanted to quickly highlight 4 of them because I think they're important issues that probably are still part of the debate and maybe some of the issues you want to discuss today. I suppose one of the questions that kept coming up, well, if we do have a child guarantee, how do we ensure it actually has an impact on the ground and leads to things changing? And I think the message we were getting from quite a lot of people was that at the EU level, things are most effective when they're fairly specific and you can see if they're being implemented or not implemented. But we had to somehow balance that with the idea for a need for a very broad, comprehensive approach on issues of child poverty. So I think the challenge is to develop a child guarantee that in parallel has a comprehensive strategic focus on overall outcomes that the Parliament wanted, but then tries to identify some understandable and tangible policy levers at national or subnational level that will actually achieve the outcomes. And if you can identify those, then you can hold member states more accountable for delivering on those very specific actions. And that is likely to have a greater impact than just to have a general aspiration. There is a bit of an issue about how broad the child guarantee should be. We had looked in the first phase at the particular target groups Some people are arguing, well, the emphasis should be on all children. Others saying, well, the Parliament called for children at risk of poverty, or children in low-income families, or children in need. So I think there is a challenge to get the balance that clearly all children should have the rights to access to these services, but then trying to have something that is effective and particularly works for the children in most vulnerable situations. And I think the Sustainable Development Goals provide a bit of an encouragement in this, where they stress about leaving no one behind and endeavoring to reach the furthest behind first. So I think there's a balancing act again to be found in the actual child guarantee in where to focus. Then I think there is this issue about, if you're looking at essentially access to services, how does that relate to a broader national strategies on child poverty? So how do you ensure that that links in and reinforces initiatives on child income support, or on participation, or on issues around discrimination, all those types of other issues that you also need to take into account. And then the fourth issue that I think is still open but is evolving is how to increase the scale and use and impact of EU funds, so that they're used to leverage member states' policies and push member states to do more. And so they're used as a catalyst, not as a substitute for national funding. I was asked to say a quick word about the second phase, and this has got a very exciting title, A Study on the Economic Implementing Framework of a Possible EU Child Guarantee Scheme, including its financial foundations. But in effect, we're asked to look more at some of the costs and benefits of action in this area and provide some economic and financial analysis. But in particular, we've been asked to look at an understandable and tangible policy levers. And in doing so, we've been asked to look not now at target groups, but at children at risk of poverty. And I won't go through all the things we're doing, but I think maybe it might be just interesting to mention the specific areas that we're looking at in terms of policy levers. And essentially, from all the things that need to happen in each of the 5 areas, we've identified from the first study and from discussions we've had with the Commission, one of the key components to achieve, say, access to adequate nutrition. The one we selected there is that each child at risk of poverty should receive at least one healthy, balanced, full meal per day. We're then looking at the policies that already exist and trying to get the best examples of policies to actually achieve that. Similarly, in relation to free ECE, we're looking at each child at risk of poverty should have access to free ECE services, and then we're looking at the policies and levers that actually can be used to achieve that. On access to decent housing, we've been encouraged to focus in on the aspiration that there should be no homeless children. So then we're looking at all the policies that member states have in place for aiming and preventing and fighting child homelessness of children and their families. On free education, we're looking at the issue that there should be no school costs for children at risk of poverty. And we're looking at the policies that are in place to address that issue of no costs in countries. And sometimes in these different areas of policies we look at, to see in member states are universal, sometimes they're targeted. And we'll be looking then in more depth at a balance between the different approaches that are adopted. On free health services, we're focusing in on each child at risk of poverty should be provided with free regular health examinations and follow-up treatment at their successive growth stages. And we're looking at policies that are used to achieve this. And then the additional thing that the Commission asked us to look at was integrated services. To look at the provision of integrated services such as organisation of an extended whole day school, or network provision of key services in daycare or other settings. In other words, in what ways can policies and services across the different areas that have been highlighted come together? And so we're looking at all of those. We've already had country reports looking at each of those issues. We're now in the process of selecting from that mapping of policies some very promising good practices, which will then be examined in much more detail in terms of the costs. And from all of that, we hope to be able to then come up with some clear recommendations of things that could be transferable between countries as examples. On the Commission roadmap and consultation, I'll be very quick because I'm sure that Katerina will have more to say than this, but just to say that the Commission issued its roadmap on the Child Guarantee back in August. It's inviting feedback by the 7th of October, so hopefully everybody's getting ready to submit to that. And it's just interesting to look at some of the key elements in the roadmap. There's a clear intention to propose a Council recommendation in 2021. Interestingly, the 5 policy areas have been extended to 6 with the addition of access to culture and leisure, which is in keeping, I think, with the original Commission recommendation. The focus is on children in need in the roadmap. Very importantly, it makes a link to the consequences of COVID-19 for children. And I know this was also referred to by the Commissioner in his statement, and I think that's very encouraging that the Commission is recognising this. It talks about Member States adopting multi-annual national strategies until 2030, and then specifically implementing these through Child Guarantee National Action Plans. That's a very concrete and practical idea, and I think could be extremely useful. And I think it reflects what I took out of the roadmap, is that the focus is on trying to be practical and on implementation so that we have something concrete and useful. It then goes on, it highlights the Commission's role, it talks about the importance of consultation of citizens and stakeholders, but I'll leave Katerina to tell you more about all of that. So just quickly in conclusion, I just wanted to highlight 3 key challenges that I think need to be addressed in ensuring the development of an effective child guarantee. And I think you can all play a role in this. The first is ensuring that the child guarantee remains a high political priority at the time of COVID. And because I'm from Ireland, I have to say Brexit as well. These are very big political issues, and there is always a danger in areas of social policies that when it comes to the crunch, your issue gets squeezed out. So I think we all have a job to do to say the child guarantee and issues of child poverty are absolutely central to these issues. And I think the second thing is trying to ensure and making sure we have inputs to ensure that there is a balance between encouraging a comprehensive approach, but also ensuring that the child guarantee ends up having some very tangible, concrete actions within it, which Member States can be held to account for delivering in the future. I think we all have a job to do in ensuring that Member States support the proposal, or hopefully the proposal that will emerge for a Council recommendation, and to ensure that Member States support the ideas going from the Parliament and indeed from the Commission for increased financial support to back up the child guarantee in the next round of EU funds. And that's something that I think there's a lot of work to be done with individual Member States to push them to say that this is important and you need to support this. And then looking a little bit to the future, I think there are going to be real opportunities, and we should be preparing for these now in our own countries, to use the child guarantee. We should be thinking about the possibility to encourage our Member States to ensure that we have in place really comprehensive strategies to combat child and family poverty. And I think we can use the child guarantee to encourage much better identification within Member States of children that are in need, that face key barriers to accessing essential services. And we can use the guarantee as a sort of trigger for the development and funding of better policies and programs to overcome those barriers at national, or in some countries it would be more operated at a sub-national level. And then I think that the existence of a Council recommendation and a child guarantee will be very important in terms of monitoring and reporting on what happens for children in the future. And I think we can all play a role looking forward into the future to using a child guarantee to hold Member States to account for delivering on the aspirations that were set at the very outset by the Commission. So it's an exciting opportunity. You have a key role to play in it. I really look forward to hearing the outcomes of your discussions today. Thank you very much.